So with no further ado, I would love to welcome our keynote speaker, Ms. Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. Yes, let's give it up. She is, of course, the author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. And she's also the 2016 inductee of the U.S. Cooperative Hall of Fame, and for very good reason. She is a co-op educator, research and activist, as well as a professor at the Community Justice and Social Economic Development, and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at the John Jay College, City University of New York. She is a proud mother of Susan and Stephen, and grandmother of some little ones, Stephen, Hugo, and Ismail Nembhard. So without further ado, please give it up for the lovely Dr. Jessica Gordon.
Thanks. All right, so good morning. Happy for everyone to be here. Is it better if I just scream and not try to hold this even? Is the screaming too much for the, okay. Not that I'm really screaming, but anyway. Let me know if you can't hear, but yes, please definitely move up if you can't hear. So I also want to thank the organizers, and I want to acknowledge the original occupants of the land, as well as our ancestors, and remembering the struggles of enslaved laborers, but also those who continue to labor without just compensation. So welcome. We're talking today about mutual aid, solidarity economies, cooperatives, and I decided that the best way to talk about that is to kind of give you, I have a list of sort of 10 benefits of cooperatives and mutuals to their communities. But I'll start out with a little bit of background. What do I mean by a solidarity economy, which I believe co-ops and mutual aid all fall into. And then a little bit about why African Americans have used solidarity, mutual aid, and cooperatives. And then I'll go into my 10 reasons with examples from African American mutual aid and cooperatives. So by solidarity economy, we're talking about economies that are very plural, organic, based on values and caring, grassroots approach, using diverse groups of people and diverse strategies, sharing values, commitment to human beings and to human productivity and human well-being, and thinking about transformative. The solidarity economy notion in the 21st century is really about being transformative against the neoliberal capitalist forces that are oppressing people, and recognizing the different ways that human societies have addressed oppression and exclusion and done things to be inclusive. And then the other notion, this we build the road by walking, meaning we're doing it, right? We do it, we practice it, we're doing it. It's not necessarily things that we theorize about and then try out, but it's things that we do in our everyday lives, that we work on as human beings, and that we try to insert into everything we do. So my focus is really on cooperatives, but cooperatives, as far as I'm concerned, started with mutual aid societies, and so cooperatives and mutual aid to me are almost the same thing. Cooperatives are a little bit more structured and usually follow some legal guidelines. Mutuals are a little bit more informal. But they're companies or enterprises owned or controlled by the people who actually use their services, need their services, or do the work. They're very values-driven. You're going to hear that throughout the whole presentation in terms of really a focus on values instead of on profit-driven motives. They're formed for a very particular purpose in most cases, right? To satisfy some kind of group need and then provide that quality good or service or process at an affordable price or affordable cost. Often it's about the fact that the market, right, what we consider the market, isn't doing it. So if you think about rural electricity, right, it's not profitable for utilities companies to wire places that are very far apart and have very low is it low population density? Yes, right? And so some areas don't get electricity, but you can use a co-op or a mutual aid society where everyone who needs electricity pools together to pay for the lines and to put the electricity in places that wouldn't be considered profitable. That's what we mean by something the market isn't doing. People share risk as well as share the surplus in these kinds of arrangements, and they're democratically governed. That's one of the most important things, right? One person, one vote. People have a chance to really participate and make a difference, make decisions about either the work that they're in or the things they want to buy or the services they're going to get. It's not imposed upon them or forced upon them in that sense. Cooperatives have 7 principles, which I'm not going to try to mention here, and then they also have values of solidarity and self-help that I kind of listed already. The year of the co-op, when the UN said 2012 was the year of the co-op, the US co-op movement actually had a contest. They wanted to know why your co-op rocked or why you think co-ops rocked, and then they picked sort of the 10 best, what they thought were the best. And this was the poster that came out of it. I don't know how well you guys can see it, but right, it's all some of the same stuff, right? Democracy, equality, equity, giving back to community, viable and just alternatives, global and local, part of an international movement, but also part of local movements, etc. So anyway, I like the poster, so I thought I'd put that up there. The other thing I want to say is about the universality of co-ops. When I first started studying them, I guess that was 20 years ago maybe, it seemed like they were sort of a thing that the Europeans invented and then brought to the US and Canada and then sort of promulgated out to the rest of the world. But the more I really started studying them, I read a book by W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a famous black intellectual. He wrote in 1907, he wrote a book on black co-ops, the only other book besides mine. I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm really bad with titles. Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans was what he wrote. And he called it specifically economic cooperation because most of the book is about mutual aid societies, and then some of the book is about officially incorporated cooperative businesses. And his point was that we have participated in economic cooperation in all different kinds of ways. And when I started studying co-ops, I realized that actually every group, right, there's no population in this world that actually didn't start out with a cooperative economics, with economic cooperation. So that's partly what I mean by universal, right? Every era of our existence, of human existence, every population, every human population continue to practice and have practiced economic cooperation in some way, whether it was codified in the way that co-ops got codified in Europe in the 1880s or not. We all practice it, we all do it. So, you know, if you give me a society, we can find ways that they've used mutual aid, cooperation, solidarity in their economic practices. And everybody has that notion of the common good, the commons, creating commonwealth, common areas, right? And then there's been different practices. When I talk to black immigrant groups, like Caribbean and African groups, they understand like the revolving loan funds and what we call asusus. That's very prominent in their society where everybody puts in some money to share so that then you have a pot of money when somebody needs it, right? Which is basically what the mutual aid societies do, right? Often they start out as burial societies, widow and orphan societies, health societies, right? Everybody puts in a certain amount of money and then the person who needs it or the family that needs it each month gets to take out what they need from the pool. And you know, the group keeps replenishing it. Often you have rules for who can use it and when, or sometimes you literally revolve it. Each month one family gets the pool of money. So there's lots of different ways that people have shared money, shared economic activity, and shared the means to well-being so that everybody in the community can have it. And so that's the kind of thing I mean when I even talk about co-ops, even though, you know, sometimes we do have to talk about the legal incorporated entity of co-ops, but mutuality, solidarity, mutual aid, cooperatives, to me, they're all really part of the same hand, right? They might have slightly different fingers. And then, yeah, so one of the things in the US we can look at is indigenous efforts, the efforts that early African civilizations had, that African people brought with them when they came to the US and tried to maintain and retain. And also often now, a lot of the people working officially in the co-op mutual aid movements are immigrants who also bring experience of working together and that kind of thing from the countries they came from. So that's why I like to talk about the universality. That's the cover of my book, and if I had to summarize it in 3 words, I would say it's about survival, resistance, and prosperity, right, or collective prosperity, right? But it is, I tried to look at the history the way that Du Bois had laid it out, right? What's the history of mutuality, mutual aid? How did those things develop and form and morph into more formal cooperatives? What kinds of cooperatives? What were the struggles, the lessons learned, the achievements, etc. I'm not going to go through everything that I learned in the book, but a lot of it will come out in this presentation. And I think this slide summarizes a little bit, right? So hundreds of mutual aid societies I found, though most of them I found because I read about them from Du Bois, but I also found some others that he didn't have. Early black communal towns and cooperative towns, formal co-op businesses, basically from the 1780s to 2013 is my coverage period. The most prolific periods were the 1880s, the 1930s and 40s, and the 1960s and 70s for African Americans. It might be similar for other groups too, but those were the periods specifically for African Americans. I name about 162 legally incorporated cooperative enterprises in the book, in addition to talking about these other issues. And really, I found them in rural areas, urban areas, in the north, in the south, in the Midwest, in the west. So there wasn't any real geographic concentration. There wasn't even an industry concentration, right? I pretty much have examples from every kind of industry and every kind of activity, producing and service and finance. And then I also found, I think, some information about some credit unions, though I didn't focus on credit unions and I didn't focus on housing co-ops. Du Bois had found 20 credit unions and about 154 co-ops before or by 1907. So he found a bunch of stuff earlier. Some of his stuff I didn't repeat. I focused as much as I could on the 20th century, but I set the stage with the earlier stuff. So before I go further, I want to talk a little bit about the barriers I found and why I named the book Collective Courage, and then I want to focus on the positive stuff for the rest of the time. Somebody tell me when I have like 10 minutes left? I can't remember. We decide an hour, right, for this part? Okay. From when you want me to finish, yeah. So I can figure out how to when I want to wrap up. So the first barrier, actually, I just changed this list around. I used to have capitalization and access to capital as the first barrier, but actually, really the first barrier is ideology, right? The fact that we live in a society that's very much about individualism and capitalism, right? Get your own and don't care about anybody else. And that gets in the way, even though, as I said, almost every group practices and has practiced and continues to practice cooperation and mutual aid. We think of it as something on the side, right? We don't think of it as real economics or the real part of our lives, right? It's kind of the extra thing or the side thing we do. Or if we're really starving, it's a necessary thing to do, but it's like a stepping stone. We don't see it as the end, right? Because ideologically, we don't see it as valuable, right, as becoming little capitalists and becoming millionaires regardless of what happens to everybody else. So our ideology, yesterday we talked about the fact that I think we need to change kindergarten, because I think kindergarten is actually where we solidify that ideology of individualism. And right, in fact, by kindergarten you learn that if you consult with somebody else in your group, that's cheating, right? And by first grade, you're actually penalized for it. And yet, when we grow up, we want everyone to consult each other and to learn from each other and to work together, right? But meanwhile, we spent 12 years teaching them it was the wrong thing and that they were going to get in trouble for it and whatever. So that's what I mean by ideology gets in the way. Lack of adequate, proper orientation and training, information and education about mutuality cooperatives, acting in a solidarity way in economics. Again, you know, we basically teach people that if you don't make it, if you make it, you made it on your own, right? That's what everybody says. Bill Gates and all those people, do they recognize all the support they got from government, all the things that their employees did to help them, what their wives did, right? No, they just say, oh, I did it, right? I deserve all the millions because I did it by myself. And so again, that notion that we don't understand, we're not taught about how to value cooperation. We're not taught how to see it, right? It's invisible in our, at least in the economic part of our lives. And we're not taught how to cooperate economically with people, how to do it, how to make decisions together, how to run an effective meeting where everybody gets a chance to say something or have a perspective, how to resolve conflict, right? So we don't have enough training and orientation. Distrust and excessive competition, right? We're often taught to distrust each other rather than to trust each other. And we're always in competition with each other. Then there's capitalization and access to capital, which is also a huge barrier. But as I said, I don't think it's as big as these other two or three. Politics and policies. We're also learning in the co-op world, especially the worker co-op world, how important municipal and federal policies are to co-op development. If you don't have the right policies in place, it makes it really hard to do these things officially. And then racism, patriarchy, classism gets in the way of how we relate to each other. It goes back to the trust and distrust, right? If we're feeling all these differences and schisms, then it's hard for people to come together in a trustful relationship, especially when it's about money, right? Money is sort of the hardest thing to trust each other about, unfortunately, in this society. And then specifically in African American communities, but I suspect this is also true in other communities, and I know it was true in labor movement, especially the early labor movement, is the sabotage. Efforts at collective economic action were often thwarted by white supremacist terrorism against the activity, racial discrimination, financial barriers of all sorts. And so it really took courage and persistence to continue to use these alternative models in the face of those kinds of challenges and barriers and, you know, literally violence. Sometimes people got lynched, sometimes the co-ops got burned down on one end, and on the other end they would be denied loans, denied a place in a community to do the work because they were considered the wrong kind of economics. So I named the book Collective Courage because in the end I realized what was the commonality was that it really took a lot of courage and persistence to continue to do this, and yet I found a continuous history of cooperative and mutual ownership throughout U.S. history, particularly for African Americans, which is who I was focusing on. So the good news is that some of the barriers like segregation and discrimination actually encouraged and forced people to come together for mutual aid, right? One, just to survive. Two, we realized early on that if we joined together, we could have better outcomes and do things better. And so this weird, right, dialectics in the world, contradictions in the world, the discrimination and the segregation in some ways actually pushed African Americans to be more cooperative, more collective, and to do more activities. And in some ways led to some economic independence as we realized if we focus on ourselves and work on what we can do together, we don't need to depend on other groups. And we have some very extreme examples like maroon societies, which were runaway enslaved peoples, ran off into the swamps and into places where nobody else was and created their own communal life there for as long as they could. some of the communal towns and stuff, and then other ways it's just a co-op business or a mutual aid society that people do on the side. The self-help ideology, the grassroots economic organizing are all sort of an integral part of what this is about. So marginalization also forces people to think about alternative economics and to then engage in alternative economics. This way they can design, manage their own businesses in a way that makes sense to them, that recognizes their culture better. Maybe it recognizes some geographic issues, some language issues, other cultural issues, and as we said, enables people to really be much more in control of their economics. And examples from early enslaved African Americans are actually the Underground Railroad, and that's actually was an integrated, that was blacks and whites together, and actually some Native Americans, all helping African Americans get out of enslavement. Also pooling money to buy each other out of slavery. Sometimes we had some skilled workers who were able to make a little money on the side. They would save it up and maybe buy themselves out of freedom, but then they'd come back and buy their parents, buy their siblings, buy their children, their wives, etc. And so there's that kind of pooling of resources early on. And then, as I said, the creation of intentional communities, also using money to start your own schools. If you remember, not only did African Americans not own our own bodies, but we weren't even allowed to learn to read and write or to teach ourselves. And so all that had to happen separately, clandestinely, in different ways. And so the mutual aid societies and the co-ops really provided quality goods and services, often when they weren't provided, saved costs, helped to increase income and wealth, combated racial discrimination, increased economic stability and self-sufficiency for African Americans, created decent jobs or saved decent jobs, provided some kind of independence and some level of self-determination, and develops leadership. And so you'll see I'm also going to end up focusing a lot on the leadership, because it turns out that's another really important part of the story. It's not just the economic independence and economic survival and trying to create well-being, but it turns out there's all these social benefits to cooperating, to working together, and some of them are people developing capacities that then help them to be leaders. So the 10 ways that mutual aid and co-ops benefit their communities. These are the 10 I'm going to talk about. Address market failure and marginalization, the joint ownership, democratic participation, education and training, leadership development, meaningful work, anchoring and recirculating resources, wealth creation, economic and environmental sustainability, and civic participation. And I have some examples, at least for some of these. So I explained market failure already, and I think I might have even said this whole slide already, but anyway, the co-ops help to address right where markets fail, especially for exploited people, right? Markets don't work as well for us, and so the co-ops actually help people to survive as well as to create some well-being in their communities. And so when we needed, right, when we needed income, when we needed food, when we needed some level of control, when we needed better jobs, we often would turn to a co-op, a mutual aid society, to try to do that, especially if we were excluded. Also, some economic independence. Once you have self-determination, right, that gives you a little bit of economic independence. I have here the Freedom Quilting Bee and then the Black Panther Party example, but also another example would be Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi and Freedom Farm. She was talking about needing that economic independence because when they registered to vote and tried to do anything for their civil rights, they were retaliated against economically. She was a sharecropper. She and her husband were evicted from the land they were sharecropping because they registered to vote. And so she was saying, right, we need some economic independence in order to even fight for our legal rights. We've got to own our own land, create our own food, right, feed ourselves so that then we're not beholden to the people that we're demanding our rights from to also keep us fed and clothed and housed. And so that's what I mean when I talk about the economic independence of this. Freedom Quilting Bee in the late 60s was also a group of sharecropping women in Alabama. They, actually a priest suggested to them that they might want to sell some of their quilts to make extra money. It turned out to work very well, so they created a co-op. In a few years, they had enough money and bought 23 acres of land. They used that land to build a sewing factory, but now that they were sewing in a factory, in a plant, and not sewing at home, they needed childcare and after-school programs, so they also put those on their property. Now that they were property owners, some of them didn't need to sharecrop anymore. Some of them, the co-op also actually leased some of their land to other former sharecroppers who were being thrown off their land for registering to vote. So their co-op allowed other members of the community some independence, and sometimes they sold a plot or two to a farmer who was able to, a black farmer who was able to actually buy it and own his own land. And so again, this whole system, right, once you've got the women making money from their quilts and helping their own families out of poverty, the co-op itself becomes a stabilizing independent force in the community and is able to do these other things, right? So childcare, land ownership, etc. The Black Panther Party we studied pretty extensively yesterday, right? Most people know of it as a shoot 'em up, by any means necessary self-defense group, but really their focus was community development. And if you look at what mostly they did, they had about 27 community programs that were mostly free to help other people, and it included a lot of collectivism and cooperatives. Their newspaper was a collective effort. They had co-housing. They had co-op bakeries, co-op shoe making, and they provided all kinds of services, as they called them, programs pending revolution, but ways to make sure that they were attending to the needs of their community, including education. So they had the free breakfast program, and at the same time they were educating young people while they were feeding them before they went off to school and learned the wrong stuff. They fed them and taught them things that they thought they needed to know more about their own history and that kind of thing. So again, connection with survival, with education, with co-ownership, and those kinds of connections. They also had free health clinics. I know some of you are interested in doing health mutual aid stuff, so that's another example there. Also, we're finding that immigrant women have been using co-ops recently in the 21st century for economic independence, survival first and then economic independence. The worker co-op movement in the United States is actually being driven by new worker co-ops, mostly immigrant women, not all, but a lot of the newer co-ops are from immigrant women in all different areas: childcare, house cleaning, catering, etc. Also, my new pet project is looking at worker co-ops and co-ops for incarcerated and previously incarcerated people. And that's another example of the importance of economic independence through cooperation and cooperatives. Because if we think about it, incarcerated and formerly incarcerated are some of our most marginalized people, right? They're exploited both within and without the justice system. If they return and have served their time, they still often can't get jobs, right? They have to legally identify themselves as previously incarcerated. They're used as slave labor in prison and can't support their families. When they get out, they're either unemployed or in the underground economies because they can't get employed. They often don't have the skills, right? If you've been in jail for 20 years, you don't really know the technology. The jail I teach in, the state prison I teach in New York, they can't use the internet. They have computers, but they're closed, and they can use them to type up their papers if they can get on the list to get time, right? And if there's paper to print out their paper with. So they're really not up to date, right? But the whole world, almost everything is technology now. So that's what I mean by they don't have the right skills. They need different kinds of skills. And in some ways, they're newcomers to the market because of that, but also they also have these previous bad experiences, right? Sometimes they're in jail because the economy failed them, right? And so they don't have a good relationship to economics. So doesn't that sound like they're a great candidate for mutual aid and cooperatives, right? So I've been looking at places around the world, because we're behind. This is another place where the U.S. is so backward. Around the world, there's lots of places now that they're actually even allowing imprisoned people while they're convicted, while they're in prison, to own their own worker co-ops and to control their own work and develop worker co-ops that make sense for them. So one of my favorites is this artist co-op in Puerto Rico. It began with an art therapy course. They started making sculptures and stuff, and after a while their families said they didn't want any more of their sculptures, and they were trying to figure out what to do with their art. At least that's how one person tells the story. And so they thought, oh, maybe we could sell our art. So they looked into some different business models. They liked the co-op model because they also thought it reflected how they were working. Some of them had started collaborating on the art. Like one of them would do the sculpture, another one would make the base, and another one would paint it. And so they felt like they were doing more collaborative work, and they liked the co-op model. They petitioned the corrections department to give them co-op education, co-op economics education. And the League of Co-ops, the Puerto Rican League of Co-ops, actually sent them a volunteer educator. And so they got educated, they were ready to incorporate as a co-op, and then they found out that Puerto Rican law, incarcerated people are not allowed to be in a co-op, especially not allowed to be on the board of directors. They actually got a meeting with the governor at that time. This was about 13 years ago. And the governor got them in touch with the state assembly, and they got the law changed. And so then they incorporated their co-op, and then they worked with the outside co-op community. They used the League of Co-ops again, actually did a lot of their marketing, had them sell their stuff at co-op meetings and things like that. They ended up with an MOU with the corrections department. 15% of their profits goes to pay for office space, electricity, computers that they use that are owned by the corrections office. And so they give them some of their profits. They also got a MOU that allowed some of them to go out of the prison to sell their wares, and so they had another relationship where they pay for all the expenses, including extra security, to do that. And so because they're a viable business, they're able to cover these costs and pay these things. And so they're actually bringing money into the corrections office as well as bringing money for themselves. They now are able to send money home. In fact, they have a rule that if you're a parent, you have to use some of your earnings to send home for child care, child support, things like that. So they created their own internal rules of how they wanted, what they wanted to be able to do with the money and how they wanted people to act. What's the sorry? What is the a memorandum of understanding. So that's like the contract they have with the corrections department. So one of the MOUs they have is that 15%, what the 15% of their profits covers that they give back or that they pay to the corrections. And then they have the other MOU about traveling. What are the rules? When can they travel to sell their stuff? Who can go and how much they have to pay to cover the extra security, that kind of thing. And so they retain 10% of their profits in the co-op. 75% gets distributed to their owners, right? That's like their salaries and their dividends. And then that money, as I said, they have to pay to support their families. They have to use some of the money to support their families. Some of them, so I can't remember if Puerto Rico has it, but some of the co-ops, the money is used for restitution also. They have to pay their victims. And so often prisoners go into debt because they owe this money to their victims. But when they have these co-ops and are bringing in money, they can then pay those victim fees. Ethiopia has a really fascinating program like that. Italy, I think, was one of the leaders in this. They actually have in prison people who have day jobs out in the world. Like one is a 5-star chef, and he works in the restaurant all day and then sleeps in the prison. And the restaurant is actually what they call a social co-op. It's part worker owned and part owned by the social services who support the prisoners in this. So it's really fascinating, again, notion of another marginalized population that you can use this with. 2, joint ownership, right? Pooling of scarce resources, leveraging those resources that you've pooled, reducing individual risk, profit sharing, collective ownership and democratization of ownership, and addressing especially low income, capital flight, lack of expertise and experience. So co-ops are a way, right, to bring people together, not just like in a joint stock ownership where, you know, the stock helps the company to raise money, but in this case it's a way to really bring people in to work together on a project to solve some problem and to make dignified work. 3, co-ops and mutuals promote democratic participation. In fact, that's one of their main values, right? That this has to be about democracy and about working together. So being a decision maker in the business, having a say, being part of making the work rules if you're an employee, right? And we're finding in research that this participation really matters, especially in worker co-ops, but in any co-ops. The more participatory it is, the more people see how their voice matters, that they can have decision-making power, the more productive, the happier, the more productive people are. For worker co-ops, the more democracy you have, the lower turnover, the more productivity you get, and so it actually can be an important resource for making the co-op better. And you get higher satisfaction. We call them social efficiencies, right? Democratic participation creates these social efficiencies, meaning people work together better, work better in a setting, right? The teamwork. We also talk about social capital building, right? You build skills to how to work together, how to make decisions together, how to be a human being. And you'll see at the end I have that thing about civic participation. Some of these social efficiencies and social capital development that happen from being in a democratic workplace also spill over and make you more participatory in the rest of your life and other civic activities. Education and training, this is a huge one. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. I think my second slide says that almost every African American cooperative that I found in the history that I did started with a study group. But also in modern day co-ops and mutuals, the thing that I found that's one of the most important explanations for success and longevity is how well they handle education and training of their members and of the public. And so that includes, right, just making sure everybody understands the co-op model and how to govern a cooperative. It also includes making sure everybody's well trained in whatever business the enterprise is involved in. It makes sure that people feel connected and involved in education, right, and that it's always continuous and evolving, that there's good orientation, there's good continuous training, there's good participation, right, training, creating participation. We talked about it yesterday a little bit about conflict resolution. A lot of the co-ops don't do enough with conflict resolution, but the co-ops that last the longest and seem the most productive do address conflict resolution. And so making sure how to fit that in, right? How do you make decisions? How do you come to consensus? How do you address when everybody doesn't agree? How do you not let that stymie or hold back or destroy the company? And then having a well-trained board of directors, because most cooperatives, and I think mutual aids, have some kind of board of directors or steering committee, that kind of thing. They need education. And then also it turns out educating your public, whether it's your clientele or your neighbors, right? The more they understand about what you're doing, the more they're going to support you. In the Black community, it turns out that community support is one of the things that stopped some of the sabotage and some of the undermining of the co-ops when the community came and surrounded, either physically or spiritually, whatever helped and supported an effort, it made a difference. So even that level of education, making sure the people who see you or who use your company or who pass by you understand what you're doing, so that if you need support or if you need policy changes, right, they can be supportive out in the world. And so, yeah, almost all the co-ops I studied, and I think most co-ops, especially among subaltern groups, start with study circles, right? You come together to try to understand what's happening in your community and then learn together about how to own a business together, how to work together on an enterprise. And so that turns out to be, I think, as I said, one of the most telling things about why a co-op might last or how it stays long. But it's also telling about that how people develop together, right? You don't just pull a co-op out of thin air, right? It's because people have talked together, have looked at options, have talked about what they need, and then they realize that there's a structure that might help them, or they kind of, what do you call it, trip into a structure and then learn how to run or how to use that structure. Like even the prisoners, right? They kind of had some notion of that they wanted to work cooperatively, and then one of them read something in a newspaper about a co-op and then said, oh, that's the structure, and so then they studied it, right? So those kinds of things happen. And then, of course, the skills that you develop as a cooperator are very, very much transferable in all different aspects of your life, as a parent, as a family member, if you're even working another job in addition to the co-op stuff you're doing. A lot of those skills just come in handy for a lot of other things and make you a better rounded person. I think I said all this already. The other thing that I found for the black co-ops is they actually used materials. Some of the groups actually said, you need to read this, subscribe to this magazine. They actually had book clubs and things like that. So again, very deliberate, not just that they came together to talk, but they actually were very deliberate. What are the resources? What should we be reading? How should we be studying this? They would bring other people together, right? I think somewhere I have a slide about study tours. They would actually go to other co-ops and see how they were working, what they were doing. A couple times, groups from the U.S., especially black groups, actually went up to Nova Scotia and studied the Antigonish movement there. But they also went around the United States and studied different movements. So I've got two, I think, examples of how important education was. Gary, Indiana, in the 1930s. Great Depression, the last bank pulls out of town, and the next week some teachers and principals at one of the black high schools decide to come together and talk about how they're going to revive their neighborhood. One of the members knew a little bit about co-ops or had heard about one and started talking about it. They decided to study the co-op model, and after about 18 months they opened a store, a grocery store. But they also instituted 2 co-op courses in the night school. I don't know, like some of you are old enough to remember night school. Do they even have night school anymore? But anyway, night school is adult education often in the high schools, right? You had adult courses at night to finish high school or to do continuous education. Anyway, they instituted 2 co-op courses in their night school, which ended up being the most subscribed of their night school courses for about 3 or 4 years. And one was on the history of cooperatives, and the other was something about co-op governance and principles or something. So they really took their education seriously. The Women's Guild actually never stopped meeting. They met continuously for the whole, I think it was 6 years that they had a co-op society there. So they started with a grocery store, which became actually the largest, highest grossing black grocery store in the United States during the Great Depression. They then created a credit union because they actually had a whole 5-year plan about the credit union helping to develop other co-ops and to stabilize their community. It didn't exactly work, but they ended up opening a second grocery store and a gas station, a co-op gas station. So they had a whole co-op society for a while, especially got them through the Great Depression. Jacob Reddix, one of the founders, went on to actually become the president of Jackson State University, or it was Jackson State College at the time. But in his memoirs, and actually he also wrote an article about this project, he says that education was the most important single factor in their success. The fact that they took it so seriously and were doing education from the beginning to the end. And also he's one of the ones who said that the Women's Guild pretty much saved their co-op society because the women kept pushing, kept studying, kept pushing things. Also the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right, considered the first independent black labor union, again started in the late 30s and through the 40s. They actually had a whole in addition to doing the labor stuff, they had a whole parallel co-op movement that was run by their ladies auxiliary. That's the maids and the wives of the sleeping car, the maids in the sleeping cars and the wives of the porters were in the ladies auxiliary. And they took very seriously this notion that it wasn't good enough to just have union jobs in the family. You had to keep black money circulating in the black community. So it wasn't going to be good enough if they just had a good job and then spent their money in a white grocery store and a white department store and that kind of thing. That they needed more what we're calling consumer cooperation, right? They needed consumer stores that were black owned that they could spend their money in and keep the money recirculating in the black community, so it really helped the black community. And so they also had a whole co-op education program. They gave out lists. This is one of the groups that told you to subscribe to the whatever the CLUSA, Co-op League of the United States, had a magazine in those days. I think it was called Cooperative something. Anyway, they told people, their members, to subscribe to that magazine so they could be reading about co-ops. The Ladies Auxiliary President used to write articles about co-ops in the Black Masses, which was their own magazine. They held study groups in most of the chapters throughout the US and Canada. They started a credit union. Actually, the first credit union they started was in Montreal, from their Montreal branch. They started buying clubs. They joined in Chicago, which is where the headquarters was. They actually joined a labor-owned eye clinic co-op, and were the only group where the black women were like integral in that co-op. And the Ladies Auxiliary actually gave the first 2,000. Perfect, thanks. So that's another example, again, of how important education was, even to a group that it wasn't survival, right? Because at least the husbands or the maids actually had good jobs. But they saw the co-op as doing more, as being more about bringing the community together, giving back to the community, and keeping that money circulating. Study tours, as I said, a lot of the black co-ops studied other black co-ops. So many of them studied the Gary example. Some went to Baltimore and DC. These are mostly in the 30s again. And then the Federal Council of Churches actually ended up doing co-op education and did co-op tours and stuff too during the 30s and 40s. I'm gonna skip some of the social co-ops in North Carolina. We did a lot of, again, we did that extensively yesterday, but I wanted, since I'm in North Carolina, to let you know there was lots of co-op activity, especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in North Carolina, based around, at least black co-op stuff. I think there was probably white co-op stuff too, but I only studied the black stuff. Based around two black independent schools, right, Bricks and Terrell County. Bricks Rural Life in Terrell County, and both of them taught co-ops to the students as well as to the parents. They helped the parents who were farmers to start co-op farms or to do tractor sharing and that kind of thing. They helped them create credit unions, healthcare co-ops, and then they started a regional-wide in Eastern Carolina coalition of black co-ops, and then a statewide North Carolina Council of Credit Unions and Associations. And so a really interesting mix of education and doing, right? Actually creating these stores and co-ops, et cetera. So Bricks ended up with credit union, co-op store, co-op education, co-op farm equipment, and then a health program. They raised money for a nurse and then got the health department, state health department, to match that money so they could have a full-time nurse. Terrell County, also same thing, study groups, credit union, co-op store, and then they had a whole co-op health services by 1941. In their health program, you signed up for $100. That guaranteed you up to you paid a membership fee of $1 and then 10 cents a month, and that guaranteed you $100 worth of health services in the 1940s. So not bad. You had a 25-cent co-payment for each hospital visit, and they had hoped to raise the money to hire a doctor for their clinic. That didn't work, but they at least had the rest of the program in place for several years. And then, as I said, they created this statewide coalition that actually created a credit union and co-op development manual, and that enabled them to create a huge number of new co-ops and credit unions. In 1936, they had 3 credit unions. after the manual came out, and they distributed it around the state. This isn't just black. They had 98 black credit unions by 1948 and 48 other black co-ops. And again, the notion is that because they created this manual and this statewide association to support co-op development, that all this development happened. So that we see we went through 4. I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to go a little faster through the rest. We're up to leadership development now. I gave you some notion of leadership development already, but really we find that women, youth, marginalized people, right, the fact that they can run and own their own enterprises obviously creates skills and stuff that then also make them feel more comfortable being leaders. Being in a co-op, right, helps you develop that sense of leadership. Often co-ops help people also understand that step up and step back, right? Take leadership on some things and learn how to step back and let other people take leadership in other areas. So you become a sort of more well-rounded leader also. You're not just sort of that charismatic leader that has to be in control of everything. So we've got lots of examples. I'm not going to go through them all, but of people, right, learning those skills and then using those both to lead in a co-op, but also using those skills to do other things, be more proactive in your PTA and other things like that. The women's leadership is really important. Weiss and Clamp, like in the 90s, found that the co-ops, that especially worker co-ops that were owned by women, really developed women's leadership. You saw the example like in Freedom Quilting Bee and some of the other examples I already gave you, how black women took a lot of leadership. I didn't talk this time, but yesterday I talked about how black women were leaders in the mutual aid societies, black mutual aid societies. And so women's leadership is important. I wanted to quickly mention the Combahee River Collective from the Civil War era in eastern South Carolina with the Gullah and Getchee communities. When Sherman liberated that area, he actually liberated it because Harriet Tubman, who hopefully you all know, Harriet Tubman was a Union scout at that time. She was the one who actually went into eastern South Carolina first and told Sherman's army, you know, gave them the reconnaissance and explained everything to them so they were able to go in there and defeat the Confederates. And as they moved on, most of the black males that were able actually joined the Union Army and left, leaving the women. And what the women did was they took over the abandoned plantations and farmed them for cotton, created handicrafts, and for the rest of the 3 years before the Civil War was over, they ran their own communities. They were known for having the best cotton, actually, and took care of the elderly, the children, and kept those communities going. So, and that was in the Combahee River area, and so it was called actually the Combahee River Colony. I forgot, the collective was actually a Boston group of black feminist women who called themselves the Combahee River Collective after the Combahee River example. The Combahee River Colony was what it was called. The collective activity that was happening was called in the 1860s. Youth development, I'm going to have to go quickly over that, but similarly we find that youth involved in co-ops, it really helps them to develop their own leadership, right, to develop their capacities. It often helps them to stay in school. They see reasons why they need to know math, why they need to be able to write well, to market their company, etc. Often it gives them income so they can then afford to go to college. One of my favorite examples is from Crenshaw High School in the 1990s. For about 12 years, they used a school garden to do farmers market and fresh produce. They gave a lot of it away to the homeless, but then they realized an entrepreneurship model. They could create salad dressing out of some of the herbs they were making in the garden and create their own business. They called it Food from the Hood, and they sold 3 different kinds of salad dressing. They sold it at school, they sold it at the farmers market, and also Amazon. This was the beginnings of Amazon, and they realized that an internet marketplace would be helpful to them because then they could sell it all over the country. So that you could, for about 10 years, you could buy their salad dressing on Amazon. They voted that 50% of their profits would be saved for college scholarships, And in the first 10 years, they awarded over $180,000 in college scholarships to their graduating members. The school actually put in a college prep program after the first couple of years because they realized they had, 4, 5, 6 students a year who now had money to go to college. And so they actually instituted a college prep program. So again, you can see the spillovers when people do this cooperative stuff, right? Other things happen around you and in your community. There's a picture of them. Meaningful work, I think we've talked a lot about that already. Usually higher wages, more productivity, more control over the work rules, that kind of thing. And job creation. Cooperative Home Care Associates is home care in the South Bronx, started in the 80s and still existing now. And they really raised the level of home care, both citywide and within the co-op, so that they can command higher prices, but also give quality jobs and quality care, make the work less contingent, more skill-based, have job ladder opportunities so you can move from just being an unskilled home care worker to a nurse, to a manager in the company. They also have a subsidiary training company, Back to Education, so you can also rise in the organization by becoming a trainer when you get tired and burned out of being a home care person. And so again, a whole system of support and bettering the job. So the anchoring and recirculating, I'm also going to go faster through this because you get the idea, right, of how co-ops can anchor and mutual aid societies can anchor grassroots economic activity and then can help recirculate, right, keep the money, keep the resources in the community. They often buy local, pay better wages, buy local, share with other local groups, help other co-ops, that kind of thing. So by recirculation, I mean keeping a dollar in the community, right? If you buy from Walmart, where does that dollar you spend at Walmart go? Right, to the multi-million, what is it, the billionaire Warren family. Right, or at best it goes to pay for the managers at the Walmart store which don't live in the neighborhood, right? But if you spend your money at a co-op store, that goes to local wages, it goes to buy locally as much as they can, the co-op gives money back to the community, that's the kind of thing. So I'm saying your money stays in the community, usually with a mutual aid or co-op, that kind of thing. And the surplus gets returned to members because, right, that's the whole purpose of the co-op, right? Surplus gets to be divided among the group. I think I said this already. Consumer Trading Company, that Gary Group, they actually provided dividends to ownership, so they gave 2% back for anybody who was a member of the grocery store. I think they tried to do the same for the gas station, etc. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, remember I told you their whole philosophy was to use co-ops to keep the money that they were making recirculating in the community and helping the black community. The Young Negroes Cooperative League, which I haven't talked about in the 30s, they had a whole model plan about how co-ops would interlink and work with each other and recirculate materials throughout the community. And so that leads us to wealth creation, right? So not only do co-ops help with income generation, but also wealth creation. Because remember, again, there's the patronage refund, right? Co-op members are allowed to distribute the surplus, or what we would call profit, to themselves, to each other, in whatever formula makes sense to them. Some co-ops actually only give a little bit out in patronage refunds. Some give a lot more. But you decide, right? It's decided democratically how that surplus is used, how much is reinvested in the business, how much is donated to other places, how much is given out in patronage refunds or dividends. But the point is, these are stable jobs, these are usually successful businesses that actually have some surplus that then can be used to give back. So your equity in the business is as important as your salary if you're a worker. And Cooperative Home Care Associates has been one of the groups that's done one of the best with this, right? 25% of their initial investment was given back annually. in most of their profitable years, so that, you know, in 4 years you made back the $1,000 that you actually invested in the business, but your $1,000 is still invested and still giving you returns, right? That's the other thing I mean about wealth, right? So the $1,000 membership is an investment, but you're getting it back if the company is successful. It's not going to other people. And you're also deciding how much you should get back and how much stays in the business, that kind of thing. They also were able to bank their unbanked members. They provided retirement for their members, and IDA, that's individual development accounts, which are match savings accounts. They're in one of those match savings programs, so they also help their members, their member owners, to enhance their savings. So that's one of the examples of the wealth creation through a co-op. And I also look at community-based asset building, right? The fact that a co-op or a business is owned collectively in a community, all the other sort of spillover, again, benefits that having a successful community-owned business in your neighborhood, there's some other spillovers. They give back to community in different ways. They stabilize the community. They allow and help for other economic activity to happen, that kind of thing. And to me, that's called, I call that community-based wealth, right? It's not just that individuals get wealth, but the community actually gets wealthier. Economic and environmental sustainability. So many co-ops, not all, but many co-ops also are thinking about the triple bottom line and the environment. Some co-ops are actually started to address environmental issues and sustainability. And also, again, the fact that many co-ops, I didn't say this, but co-ops actually have longer longevity than small businesses. And so, like, small businesses go under, what is it, like 80% in the first year, or 50% in the first year and 80% in the first 5 years, whereas co-ops, I think it's only 10% in the first year and 30% in the first 5 years or something. So co-ops actually last longer, so in that sense they're more stable. Partly it's because of all the education and pieces that have to fit together for a co-op to work. Partly it's because the jointness, right, the joint ownership and joint decision making actually makes for more stable, better businesses. There's a lot of speculation about why co-ops are more stable, but they are. But also they're more environmentally friendly, or worry about environmental stability. Often profit, human and social capital, environmental capital are all the triple bottom lines. They're not just trying to get a surplus. And there's a couple groups that do that. Wages, which is now called Prospera in Oakland, actually ended up specializing in women's ecological cleaning companies. And their first one from the 1980s was Emma's Eco Clean, and now I think it's about 20 different ecological cleaning companies that they spun out. Green worker cooperatives in the South Bronx. Their whole mission is to support green businesses that are worker-owned. And so they also look at environmental issues, organic food, anything that has to do with health, well-being, recycling, green industries. And 10, I think just in time, right? Civic participation. So I also hinted at this through the whole thing, right? The spillover effects of the leadership development, the skills that get developed in being in a co-op, the democracy, the transparency that people become to expect in a co-op, because you have to learn and know about these things in a co-op, all spill over into other things, right? It's very hard to be involved in this kind of level of activity in your co-op and not then take it home, take it to other arenas, your church, other civic places. We have co-op people who create other organizations. We have co-op people who become much more active politically in the PTA. We have co-op people who then create credit unions or do other things. And so when you really look at it, you find that this what I'm calling civic participation activity, and not just the specific economic thing that your mutual aid or co-op did, but other aspects of your life, other aspects of your community's life, you can't help but see the differences. Some of us have tried to measure it, and sometimes it's not as measurable as we would like, but when you do interviews and talk to people, you can see how it's really made a difference, or even talk to people's families, right? That's often where you really see the difference. It's how people present themselves at home. And then we do have some studies about women in co-ops, and then they take they're much more active in their children's education life and much more comfortable talking to the teachers and taking leadership in the PTA, that kind of thing. And some policy advocacy. Some of the co-ops actually do policy advocacy, like Federation of Southern Cooperatives is very active in agricultural policy at the federal and state levels. Cooperative Home Care Associates was hugely active in changing the Medicare laws around home care, things like that. So we see that co-ops don't really stay narrow, right? They don't stay in their lane, right? They spill over. And then this transparency, right? To be an active co-op member, your co-op needs to be transparent. You need to understand how to read the books and how to understand income and expense statements, and you need to know pretty much how every aspect of the co-op runs in order to make the decisions democratically, right? Well, that transparency, we also start to expect that in the rest of the world sometimes, right? And so we find that many co-op and mutual members are more demanding, right, of civil society and of their government and that kind of thing in terms of what we expect. We want our lives to be more like our mutual lives. And so that's another thing to look at. And finally, I'm on to my last 3 slides, and then I think we have like an hour for question and answer. So hopefully you guys remember what questions you had from the earlier part of the presentation. I probably should have stopped in the middle, but we didn't. So really, we're also finding when you do these testimonials, when you talk to people in co-ops, how transformative the co-op is. So they change lives, they develop people's capacities, they give people more community control. You see especially worker co-ops, right? They're in healthcare, childcare, temporary services. They lead their sectors in changing the nature of work and providing more living wages, right? Returns to work, right? The fact that you can not only get a good job, but you get a dividend from being in a co-op if that's what the co-op decides, right? We see it for African Americans, Latinx people, women, youth, immigrants, most marginalized people, but also actually, I didn't study this that much, but co-ops have been used by people who already have stuff, right? Like Midwestern farmers who already have land, they actually use co-ops to enhance the return to their land and to the return to their agriculture. So even though I've focused on marginalized people and low-income people, it's not really only that group, it's just that's the group I've cared about. So that's what I've looked at. But co-ops really enhance for any level of people, right? And if you don't realize it, right, all the big major corporations collude and cooperate also, right? That's what OPEC is, right? All the oil owners around the world. What is OPEC? It's not officially a co-op, but that's what they're doing, right? They're a mutual aid society for the oil companies. So everybody, right? And they're working together to make sure nobody, outbids or outprices the other one or whatever, right? It's all the same stuff. They just call it something different, and then they tell us we can't do it, right? But they're allowed to do it. But anyway, so it's transformative for anybody who gets involved, especially if you look at it and you look at it from a people's level. So my last slides. Oh, and the other thing about transformation, another really interesting co-op model is sex workers. And there was a sex workers co-op, Lusty Ladies in San Francisco. It now went under because of gentrification. The rent got skyrocketed on them and they couldn't afford it anymore. But that's a really interesting model. So you take, again, a marginalized group of people, right, sex workers or dancers in a peep show. And at first they just wanted to be unionized. And so they did a huge union drive, and they actually won the union drive. I love their t-shirts. They said, even bad women deserve good unions. But once they won the union, their boss decided he didn't want to run a union peep show. So he was going to sell. And then they were going to have to do the union drive all over again. So they actually realized they should buy the company themselves. And not only did the dancers come together, but they joined with the bouncers and the janitors. So all three groups bought the company together and ran it as a worker co-op, as a self-directed, self-managed, non-hierarchical worker co-op. They rotated the management team jobs every 3 months because they realized, one, you made more money that way, and two, it was very stressful. So they rotated it around so everybody had a chance to be in the management positions and make the better salaries. They also rotated what's called the individual windows. I don't know how much of the industry you want to know, but there's a group stage where about 3 or 4 dancers dance at the same time, and then there's a glass wall, and then usually the men, you have to put money in to keep them dancing, otherwise the curtain goes down. But there's also 2 individual rooms where just a man and the dancer are there with a window, and those are where you actually make the most tips. Well, in most of the industry, black women, women who are a little chubby, were not allowed to be in those windows. But lusty ladies, again, everybody rotated equally through all the different positions. And so, right, they also brought in Berkeley Free Clinic to do health care and massages, so they were worried about their own well-being, that kind of thing. Anyway, they didn't have a high profit margin, so when the neighborhood gentrified and their landlord upped the rent, like tripled it or something, they couldn't stay in business. And of course you can't move because there's one red district in San Francisco that allows this, and they couldn't go to another neighborhood because it's illegal in the other neighborhoods, and so they went under. But anyway, that's another thing about the transformation of work. In that case, when I interviewed the 2 black dancers, they just said it was the first place where they really felt valued and supported and equal, that the other houses, strip joints that they had worked at, never treated them the way they were treated lusty ladies. And so again, it's this, what co-ops can do even in those kind of jobs, right? So my last 2 slides, commonalities, right? Populism, labor organizing, civil rights, alternative economics all get connected together in these efforts. They address needs, they solve community problems at the same time, values-based, which I guess I forgot to put on there, right? It's mutual aid societies, cooperatives, collectives that provide affordable goods and services, share tools, share money, figure out ways to lend money either for land or business ownership or sharing of equipment. And then, of course, sharing profits, supplying and supporting each other, and addressing, as I said, some of these hard, right? Sometimes these hard issues of being marginalized, sometimes just addressing the need to do better in the economy. And so I wanted to leave you with a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a famous African-American scholar. He said, again, this was in 1933, so in the middle of the Great Depression, by consumer and producer cooperation, we can establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx. And so again, the notion, right, that through economic cooperation, we can be undefeatable. So I wanted to leave you with that notion. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Another round of applause. We have about 35 minutes for questions, so I would love to open it up to you all. And I apologize for the microphone not working. I'm sorry, your voice is probably worn out. But I'm going to try and project for the audience questions as well, so I can come to you and then speak them loudly, repeat them after you, so everyone can hear in the room. And then hopefully we can get you some tea afterwards. So does anyone have some questions for Dr. Nembhard?
Yes. It seems like in the early development of mutual aid, it would be important to lay the groundwork for conflict resolution, because especially in this particular time we live in, it is almost impossible not to have it with other human beings. So I'm curious about, in your work, have you found some models for conflict resolution that we all could be studying early on and could begin to talk about agreeing on which model to use so that we can maybe nip that in the bud early and teach people in Western North Carolina how to engage it early on in conflict?
Yeah, so I guess I should repeat the question for the video, maybe. But I'll just say, so about conflict resolution, how to use it more, and whether I know of good examples. All right, you were supposed to do that, but it's okay.
No, you got it.
I've got the mic for the video. Yes, I totally agree with you. I'm hesitating because I haven't found a lot of examples. I do have probably 2 I could mention to you, and maybe 3. But I totally agree with you, because that's one of the things I started noticing, especially as I started studying late 20th century worker co-ops, and I found that the ones that were paying attention to that were doing better, and were more productive and happier or whatever. And so, and these are not actually black versus white at this point. I'm just looking at all worker co-ops. Rainbow Grocery, which is a worker-owned grocery store in San Francisco, they have been sort of our gurus in the worker co-op world for how to run effective meetings, how to use conflict resolution, and how to pay attention to that sort of how to do the best self-governance you can. They usually share, especially at worker co-op conferences, they share some of their materials. They share a lot about their self-governance model. They have I think it's called a grievance committee. So they have different kinds of grievance things preset out. They're also one of the ones that I learned about how important continuous orientation and training. So they have a very rigorous orientation program, which includes understanding how you grieve an issue, how you address some conflict, right? And they have this committee, and I think they might have some kind of grievance officer. They also buddy people up. All the new people get buddied with an old person. Sorry, I don't mean an old person, with a experienced member. Thank you. And so they have a pretty rigorous, and I think they're willing to share a lot of their materials and a lot of their stuff. And as I said, they have a very rigorous orientation program, but they also have a continuous education. They're always at all their meetings. They're continuing to make sure they learn, and they sometimes bring in people, that kind of thing. So they have a really good. There's a lending circle, a SUSU in Atlanta, a group of African Americans who actually help each other to buy houses. So basically everybody puts in, I think it's actually $500 a month into the group, and then I think it's every 6 months or so, they have enough to give one member of the group, $50,000 for a down payment. What they found is that before you can join, they do a weekend retreat, and they use African practices, and they do a whole weekend, Friday to Sunday retreat about how to build trust, how to resolve conflict, that kind of thing, using, I forget which African belief system it is, but they have a whole thing. They actually shared their notebook with me once. But anyway, so that's what they do. You cannot join their Asusu, their lending circle, without having gone through that initial training, because they do want to make sure, that's a lot of money to put in, and they do want to make sure that people trust each other with the money, understand the process, and have ways to work that through, and they found that to be pretty helpful. They also found, the trust was so good that they had one couple that was in the group. Both of them lost their jobs and were going to drop out, and the group convinced them not to, and what they did was they actually they referred them to customers, so they started doing consulting and stuff, so they made enough money to actually stay in the group and eventually get themselves back on their feet and that kind of thing, so that even that level of support of each other was strong in that group. And then the final thing, and I see the hand over there, the other thing I wanted to say is I have another group, and we've been toying with this notion of conflict transformation instead of conflict resolution, right? And we've been reading the stuff that talks about, it's not really about resolving conflict, like one person isn't supposed to win over the other, or one position isn't supposed to win over the other. It's to know the notion that, right, we're all in dialectics anyway. We're stronger, right? Conflict or disagreement can make us stronger if we handle it right, right? And so if we can transform the conflict into strength, right, into better understanding and strengths, if we can understand what the conflict is about and why people have differing opinions or views about it, and then use that as a strength to come out on the other side with better, stronger policies, decisions, etc. And so if people think about it that way, also it's not considered an adversarial thing, but it's a part of the learning process, part of the dialectics of being human beings, that kind of thing. I don't know who actually creates those programs. I just know we've been talking about it informally and thinking about trying to figure out how to formalize that notion. But I know that we're not the ones who created that. It's out there in the world somewhere. I just don't know what the references are. Somebody had their hand up in the back. Was it about this topic?
It was about the word that you keep saying, Isuzu or Isuzu.
Oh, Isuzu?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Did you spell that or is there anything about that?
I think it's E-S-U-S. Isuzu, whatever. I don't actually know how to spell it, and people spell it differently, but it's actually, apparently it comes from an East African term for. And so some Caribbean, some African groups. There's also, what is it called, Bosca's revolving loan something is another name, revolving savings and loan or something. Anyway, the notion is informally people pooling their money together and sharing it with each other for specific purposes. And so these are informal but formal mutual aid groups.
Okay, so 2 questions.
Yes.
One, pursuant to the conflict resolution and so on. So it seems as though the prevailing model is kind of majority rule, one person, one vote. But I was wondering if there were some other models that were used, such as consensus or dynamic governance type of models. That's one. And the other is, you know, a lot of this seems to go back to the 30s, 40s. But, and I know you gave some more contemporary examples, but did a lot of those go under, or are they still existing today?
Okay, 2 good questions. Remember the second one, because I might forget it. But anyway, oh, now I forgot
So
the
the
first question.
consent
Consent, right.
Yeah.
So yes, I've been talking about one person and one vote, and that is very much about majority rule, but actually, especially again, late 20th century, a lot of the co-ops are now doing consensus model and trying to train, or what's called a modified consensus, right? So consensus, as long as you can get to one fairly easily. If there's not a consensus, then they revert to majority if you have to, but you try to deal with the blocks. So yes, I've noticed more and more co-ops are trying to do consensus, but not all of them. Some are still on that majority rule, but trying to keep it a sense of democratic participation.
Or nonviolent communication?
Right, and so I've heard more about nonviolent communication. Also, actually, the big thing now is sociocracy. I don't know if any of you know that, but that's what I'm learning now, that a lot of the co-ops are starting to use that as a way. So it's not exactly consensus, it's sort of nonviolent communication, but it's not just majority rule either. So I think we're getting more, I don't know if sophisticated is the word in terms of how to come to decision making, but I think people are more effective, right? People are working out ways, and also recognizing that majority rule isn't actually democratic, right? I mean, you think it is, because you think at least if the majority say something, right? But that means the minority isn't heard. And then that's back to the conflict transformation, right? Often the block in a consensus building, or the minority who don't get their vote, if you actually listened to why they weren't voting on something, you could learn a lot about what people understood or didn't understand, or maybe they have a slight difference that actually could help you be more effective or whatever. And so if you have a chance to actually listen to those quote-unquote minority views or the no votes, you can actually learn a lot, and you can strengthen your organization by trying to address them. But again, how do you address them in an efficient, effective manner? I think that's what people are, right? That's why I think some people like sociocracy, because that has a very, as far as I understand it, a very efficient sort of way to handle some of these things. But also some of the conflict resolution strategies have been interesting. I've seen one with the 7 hats. I don't know if you guys know that one, but each hat is a different way to view the issue. So 1 is the total, just the logic of it. 2 is how does it benefit the organization. 3 is how does it feel. 4, not 4, I mean the different colors, sorry. And I can't remember which color goes with what. But anyway, you're supposed to address the issue from each hat, each perspective, and get that out so that then by the time you finish all 7 perspectives, you've pretty much covered stuff you might not have thought of, and everybody gets their feelings out. Second.
Her question was about if some of the co-ops that you've discussed have gone under, right?
Oh, right. Right, and especially that there were a lot in the 30s, and if they went under. So we actually talked about this a little bit yesterday, too. I try not to talk about failure even when a co-op has gone under. And, of course, co-ops go under. I did tell you that they have lower failure rates than regular small businesses, but regular small businesses go under all the time. We don't think about that, but they do.
Especially restaurants.
So, right, so co-ops do it less, but of course they go under. But there's a variety of things that happen. The first thing is that often co-ops go under because they addressed the immediate issue that they were created for. Like some of the ones in the 30s, it was really about survival in the Great Depression. And when things got a little better, they didn't, I mean, we might think they still needed to stay, but you know, and sometimes for those groups, they now had better access to things, and they weren't needed. Sometimes it's not even about the Depression being over, but the immediate thing. Like a co-op in Baltimore after the Civil War, they started because white shipyards wouldn't hire trained black stevedores and caulkers, so they created their own business as a co-op to hire black stevedores and caulkers. Well, they stayed in business for 18 years. They had an integrated workforce, and they integrated the union. So by the 18th year, when another case of the rent going up too high, and they decided to close, they actually could close because they had addressed the issue. There was now work for black stevedores and caulkers and all the other shipyards in integrated unions. So really, yes, they went under, but first they were in business for 18 years, and second of all, they accomplished, right, well, the issues that they came together to address, right? And so the world was better when they closed their doors. You know, maybe there wasn't another co-op shipyard, but the other issues they were addressing were better. So that's one of the ways to look at it. But the other thing that I like to talk about is the continuous learning again, right? So even when a co-op ends or goes under, whether it's for good or for bad reasons, you can't undo the project, right? The mutual project, the fact that people came together, learned how to do something, ran a business together, gained additional skills, worked together, did other things in their community, supported other things in their community, right? Also, sometimes the co-ops create other co-ops in their community, and so then the original co-op isn't needed, right? So, but also the skills and the impact on community can never be a failure because there's always, right, it's always a progress in that sense. And so a lot of what I was looking at when I was looking at what happened, and sometimes I don't even know what happened to the co-ops. Like some of these co-ops, I have no idea if they lasted 5 years or 10 years because I don't know what happened. There's not good records. We talked about that yesterday too. But anyway, sorry I keep talking about yesterday, but it's fresh in my mind. But yeah, the learning, right? So the learning that people had about how to work together, the learning they had about gaining the skills in whatever the business was that the co-op did, you can't undo that. And so it's really not a failure because people in every case went on and did other new, better, different things in addition to whatever the co-op tried to do. And I think that, to me, that's sort of the lesson, that it's about process and it's about continuous development. Right? And I think we need to think of our organizations and ourselves in that mode, right? That we're always getting better, learning new things, whether it's in this form or not, or whether we have to change the form of how we're doing it. And also because co-ops so impact their communities, which is what I was trying to show with my 10 things, right? Even if it only was a year or a year and a half, right? There was a black cab co-op in Milwaukee. It only lasted 18 months because the insurance company upped their premiums and they couldn't afford them. But in those 18 months, they showed that you could actually make money serving the black community, because most of the taxis in Milwaukee wouldn't go into the black neighborhoods. But for 18 months, they actually did it successfully. The only problem was the insurance company sabotaged them because they were like, oh, you're going into risky neighborhoods, you have to pay higher insurance or whatever, which I consider sabotage. But anyway, but 18 months, they still showed, they proved a point, right? And they also showed cab drivers that they could own their own business, you know. So there's a bunch of things that happened, even though it was a short-lived. So I hope that answers your question.
If I wanted to start like a workers' cooperative or like any of these things, is there literature that I can read?
Okay, so starting a co-op, especially a worker co-op, there's tons of literature online. Start with the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, usworker.coop. Even the USDA has materials on how to start a co-op. And then, what is it, TESSA, Toolbox for Social Action? Toolbox for Education for Social Action. They have great interactive stuff on their website. I think it's tessa.coop. Another group I work with, GEO, Grassroots Economic Organizing, we have a lot of sort of case study interviews and other stuff. And then we also try to highlight, we have a couple of issues, we're an online newsletter, a couple of issues about how to start worker co-ops and some of the legal things to think about. That's geo.coop. And then there's a bunch of co-op development centers around the country. I'm trying to think of what you guys have in this area. Actually don't know, after North Carolina being a hotbed, right, in the 30s and 40s.
I know there's at least one one extension
Yeah.
agent focused on co-ops.
On co-ops, right.
I'm spacing your name, but.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of what's down here. Oh, the cooperative, right, if you want to do grocers, right.
Publication.
Yeah.
A group called the Industrial Commons.
Oh, okay.
That's in Morganton that I'm with Mountain Works that we partnered to help do co-op education.
Great. So yeah, actually, I should have asked you guys. You guys know more about supports, at least local supports. But those are the national.
And what is GEO what?
GEO is Grassroots Economic Organizing, and our website is geo.coop.coop. So there's a .coop, you know, for geo.coop. Sorry, that's my New York talking fast. You got it? Was that your other question? Didn't you have your hand up? Who had their hand up back here? Oh, that was what you were trying to get.
So at the national level, there's associations over economic cooperatives called National Cooperative Business Association, NCBA, and they have a very active international development wing called CLUSA, so NBCA CLUSA, and so their website could probably
Oh, right. Yes.
give huge resources.
Yeah, and CLUSA is Cooperative League of the United States, USA. That's actually their official name. And then somewhere, like in the 70s, they decided to call themselves the National Cooperative Business Association. And then they left their international thing as CLUSA. And then now they recently combined the two names again, claimed the name again. But yeah, they actually have materials on their website also. I think it's ncba.coop. The only thing with them is, you know, they dropped their education unit. They had it until 2005, I think. I never was sure why they dropped it. So they don't have an actual education unit, but they used to have a co-op university on part of their website, which I'm not sure if they still have it. But they did just recently reinstate their co-op development conferences. They have one in October. It's a little expensive, but they do have I think it's called the Co-op Impact Conference now. Did you have a follow-up?
To follow up, one of the things to kind of watch in terms of cooperative development is Cuba, and NCBA is helping with education. When Cuba hit a brick wall with their economy, they started to turn over, everything was state, so their mechanics, the restaurants, or whatever, they turned over to the workers to run. And so that's an experiment to watch right now.
Right. Yeah, and do they have some stuff on the NCBA website about the Cuba project?
NCBA sponsored counterparts to come up and give talks and presentations. So there is an active initiative going on right now.
Great, thanks. Who do we have next?
Isn't there a national co-op bank?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot of resources. But my question actually is, you know, you're talking about different groups that could combine their efforts to start some co-op. What about like starting a co-op in a neighborhood, like because of a geographic proximity or similarity? Do you know much about that? I mean, that seems
Well, a lot of co-ops
about living local. And
started, right, a lot of co-ops started in that vein. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, besides the rural electrics, which are clearly a geographic issue, a problem of not having electricity. I mean, a lot of the food co-ops are doing that to address food deserts, right? So that's kind of geographic, but then they connect to a larger movement, which is helpful because they have lessons learned. There's a lot of...
seems like the whole transition town
right.
movement
Yes.
would really benefit from this, you know, in a more community, local living, geographic kind of
Right. I think you're right. The transition towns probably, you know, after Hurricane Katrina, I actually wrote something. I tried to say, you know, we should rebuild New Orleans with co-op model and the co-op interlocking co-ops and a co-op Commonwealth model. Nobody took me up on it. But it sounded like a great idea to me. So I think, yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I know some of the early black co-ops were very much 1901, the mercantile, whatever they were called, Mercantile Co-op Society or whatever. They were addressing the need for agricultural supplies that weren't controlled by the white store that was gouging them. They wanted to do tractor sharing, and they wanted access to loans. And so they kind of created a grocery store, a supply store, but also they had like a little lending thing. And that was definitely very local, but they were competing with the white store, and they won, actually, that competition. And they were another one that's lasted like 20, 27 years in that neighborhood. When you look at actually the demographics of that neighborhood, they became a much more stable black community than any of the other black or white communities around them. And one of the researchers I saw who was looking at that said it was because they had this co-op stabilizing their neighborhood, so they had a higher standard of living, had longer longevity, some other things, just because they all came together to provide their local needs through this co-op society or whatever. So we do have some examples of that kind of thing, which I think we could then use to get neighborhoods to see that this could be a model for them. The other thing that's interesting to me is a lot of those models, they don't just stay insular. They find other co-ops in the next neighborhood or in the town or in the city and try to connect with them, either to share information or to buy goods together, that kind of stuff. And so you don't end up being just a small little neighborhood activity. You end up connected to a whole bigger society, and it helps in a variety of ways. So you're not quite so vulnerable to things, but also you're connected to people who are doing other things, and you can offer more services and that kind of thing because of the interlocking connections.
I want to see if anyone over here is like, I might ask you all some questions. So not if anyone over here has questions. Yes?
No, I was just waving.
Okay, so I'm just really interested in your, I can see there's a lot of threads running through, but the question of scale.
Scale.
So in New Zealand, where I come from, our largest national dairy company is a farmer cooperative. so it's pretty much all of the, the majority of the dairy farmers in New Zealand are cooperative members, farmer shareholders of Fonterra. But Fonterra is a monster, basically. So, we're talking about it in the kind of context of sustainability, of building, like the suicide rates amongst the farmers are terrible. The board have made some terrible investments. They've $750 million in China, which was a really bad investment, which they're going to have to pretty much write off. Milk prices are going down, and also what it did is cause a massive surge in irrigation, taking water beyond sustainable allocation, and also putting massive, intensive, industrial dairying, because we're quite a pastoral country, so if you're actually just doing it within the sustainable limits of the pastoral land, it's actually not a problem. But what we're getting with these really intensive dairy farms now, massive lots, is huge amount of nitrates going into our waterways. So like in Canterbury, where I come from, A, the water's over-allocated, it's destroying ecosystems, but B, the level of nitrates in the water is something like been proven under studies, or there's starting to be evidence that it's increasing the risk of bowel cancer by 6 times and things like that. So we've got this real storm brewing of just everything hitting its limits and a big convergence of problems. So what I'm wondering is, so these farmer shareholders should be able to kind of vote in this system, but what Fonterra did when all their public licence is being really severely eroded because of the environmental impacts, which is being basically externalised onto the public. So instead of actually doing what you say about having these groups about educating farmers in sustainable practice and diversification and all of these sort of things that can start to mitigate that, they spent millions on a massive propaganda campaign about how good milk is and how they're putting milk in schools. And so what I'm trying to, so there's really huge benefits to co-ops, but again, it's those underlying values and the commitment of the organising group, isn't it?
Right. So yeah, the commitment to underlying values, I think you hit it on the head. That's what I think is important. We have the same problem of what I would call corporate cooperatives. In the United States, we have Land of Lakes, Welch's Grapes, Ocean Spray Cranberry, right? I kind of, what's the word? I try to forget about them. Right. Yeah, I mean, right, they become co-ops mostly, right, to compete better against capitalism and to compete with industrialized agriculture, right? I've started talking about solidarity co-ops and mutual aid, and focus on those and not on the big agro co-ops, just for that reason, because they've lost their soul. They don't really adhere to the values in the same way. I mean, yes, maybe each of their farmers still get to vote at the annual meeting or whatever, but they don't have that same list of values and, sell. Right, right. Right. So yeah, so I agree. I think that's an issue, and sometimes when people think about co-ops, that's what they think about. I should probably say at the beginning of my talks that I'm not talking about that level, right? I'm really talking about much more smaller, much more the ones that really adhere to the principles I've talked about: self-help, mutuality, democracy, equity, right? That's why I actually start often talking about solidarity, right, and solidarity principles, because that's the co-ops that are really practicing those are the ones I'm most interested in and that I think have the promise that we all are interested in making the world better and helping each other. I don't know what we do about those big co-ops. I mean, they also tend to kind of run the National Cooperative Business Association. They're a big presence there, and a lot of the money that the NCBA has is because of the ag co-ops. I was actually shocked once because the National Cooperative Business Association supports trade agreements. But they do that because they're big ag co-ops, want the U.S. favorable trade agreements, and I thought as progressives and small farmer, whatever, that they should be against that. So I was shocked to find that out, and then someone was like, you know, don't even try to fight that one because you're not going to win, right? So there are issues even in the co-op movement, but I've kind of tried to focus on a different niche, and maybe for better or worse, but for my own well-being, I kind of avoid and ignore those guys. I think maybe at some point we might have to figure out as a co-op movement what to do about those guys. But mostly I've been trying to focus on the other stuff because I find it much more satisfying and much more promising to look at the bottom up and how to do these federations of smaller grassroots co-ops that really do practice the principles.
We are at time, but we can take one more question before we go on a break.
There was. I thought there was one more. Oh, somebody, yeah.
It seems like in order to get these small community cooperatives that can last, it could use a larger scale version of the same tactics that you're using, like the money sharing tactics could be used within cooperatives to actually pool money into a larger cooperative. And I mean, I guess that's the kind of thing that could take on these large agribusiness cooperatives and multinational companies. But how, I guess my question is how would that happen?
Yeah, how would we aggregate on a larger scale? So there's some examples. I think Stephanie's going to give us one, and then I have some, I'll have the last word, I guess.
A thing we're aiming for in the Humans United and Mutual Aid Networks, and we'll be talking about that from 10 to 10:30 tomorrow, or around 10 or 10:30 tomorrow, so hope you can join us.
Right. Also, when I talk about federations and interlocking systems, that's also the ideas that I'm thinking of, right? So if we have, right, we start with the neighborhood co-ops. This is actually a strategy a couple people have talked about, but one of the groups is the Young Negroes Cooperative League from the 30s. They had this notion, right? First you start with a buying club with local people who need something. The buying clubs then become more formal stores or whatever. Then the local group creates a credit union. Then they interlock with the other local credit unions and buying clubs. They all buy from a co-op, what's it called? Co-op factory, right? They get their clothes or they get the food from a co-op distributor or whatever, and so they, you know, it keeps building up to different levels, but each of the smaller levels has a say and control over the larger entity. And so you end up with these interlocking federations in that sense. So it's starting and controlled by the grassroots groups, but you're using the economies of scale and the larger federation idea to help, again, share ideas, support each other, buy in bulk, bigger bulk at each level, that kind of thing. And that should lead you to, you know, they had a notion of a regional credit unions that fed into this, you know, the smaller credit unions fed into and that supported them. They had these regional factories and warehouses and things that fed from the bottom up, but also then connected the regions nationally, so they had strength there. And so I am persuaded by that. It's sort of the Mondragon. People know about the Mondragon collective in Spain. That's sort of, they have, I mean, they become a little bit, they're a little bit more hierarchical now, but their initial, it was all these small worker-owned companies federating and interlocking and using a centralized credit union system and that kind of thing. And so I believe in that. I think that can work. I think that's the most important thing. I get a little nervous when people want to start these big national co-ops because I feel like you need to start up from the bottom instead of from the top. But I'm very supportive of the national coalitions and the national networks to help support what's happening at the grassroots and the bottom level. And I do believe that's going to be our savior, right, if we can really do it. Because I also think the people who are learning by doing at the bottom can help inform what are the policies we need, how do we need to do this, what are the supports we need, right, and can be help with the decision making at each level above. So hopefully that's a good place to end. Thank you so much. Thank you guys.